I was asked by several educators to tell my story in schools, sometimes to senior groups or whatever. But for a long time, I wasn't alone. For a long time, many of us didn't want to talk about it. And as I was telling my friend who accompanied me today, it used to be that I couldn't function or cope very well for a couple of months after I told my story. That's how painful it was. And since then, I've written a short book about it, so I think I'll go home and not feel quite as bad. But telling the story was very painful, so we didn't. Many of us kept it to ourselves, and then in the 70s, we began to talk about it. I was born in Brussels, Belgium, on August 10th, 1935. My father's name was Gershon, excuse me. My mother's name was Mirla, or Mirce, English, and I had a brother whose name was Max. My father and my mother worked at home. They manufactured pocket books. We weren't fromme Menschen. We were, I don't know if we were secular. Secular seems to be a more modern name. So Shabbos was not necessarily special, except I think they might not have worked on Saturday at home. My father died when I was 6 years old, so I only have photograph memories of him. My mother was very upset about his dying when I was so young, and the war was on. So she was a little bit not too attentive, and so I suppose my relationship wasn't great. And my brother was 9 years older, so he really wasn't that interested in a little boy. So our relationship before the war, although I felt very warm toward him, was not fantastic. I went to Anderlecht school. This is one of the boroughs in Brussels. I went there. It was interrupted by the war. And then later on, I went to Latene, which is a high school, an academic high school, also in Brussels. When I went to first grade, I think I was there a total of perhaps 2 months. And it was the first evidence that I had as a child that something was wrong. I was sitting in the classroom, and two other children my age, 6 years old, we were in first grade, were called out by the Gestapo from the class because we were Jewish. What I can describe to you is the first time I realized that there was something wrong about the war, in that I was in what was my bedroom, or what was used as my bedroom, and my father and 3 of his friends were playing cards. It was in the evening, and suddenly they said something about, we heard some noise. I guess I'm calling it bombing noise, and they stopped playing cards. They went to shut the curtains off and shut the lights off and looked out. And so I knew there was something wrong. I didn't know what it was because I was all of 5 years old. I had just awakened by the noise. And so it's only afterwards that I realized that for me, that was the first sign that there was something wrong. And so perhaps that was my first experience with Germans perhaps being there. But outside of that, I was 6 years old before I realized wearing the Gala Latte, which is a yellow star on my coat, and in the streets being told to be careful about having anything to do with Germans. In retrospect, I can only say that I felt odd about it. I guess I felt suspect of something. I felt as though I had done something wrong, but it wasn't until much later on that I realized that I hadn't. When I was about 6 years old, a cousin of mine who was a medical doctor came to take me away from, this was after my father had died, came to take me away from my mother because things were getting more and more dangerous for Jews, and they were, meaning the Gestapo were visiting more and more Jews coming to their apartments, etc. So he was worried about me, so he came to take me away. He wasn't involved in the underground being people who were fighting the Nazis in Brussels. And so I guess he had connections and knew of places where children were hidden, and brought me about 8-9 blocks away from where we lived to a church where the priest clandestinely hid me and approximately 6 other Jewish children in the basement of the church. I was very afraid. I was brought to the priest. My cousin, his name was Muttel, left right away, told me to be quiet and not say anything except when I was asked, and to just speak to the priest. The priest took me to the basement, into this sort of dark room where 5 other children were lying in cots, and I was put on a cot, and I stayed there, and he was hiding us, not wanting anybody else to know, for fear that they would tell on him that he was hiding Jews. So we had to stay quietly in that room. I did, but very soon, perhaps 2 or 3 nights after that, I started peeing every night in bed and wetting the sheets. And I didn't say anything, and the priest didn't say anything for a few days. He evidently changed the sheets every day, didn't let any of the other boys know about it. And then pretty soon it was difficult for him because he had to have the sheets washed, and so he thought that the woman who did the washing of the sheets, who didn't live, she lived across the street, she was the laundress, he was afraid that she would discover that there were perhaps people living there that shouldn't be. And so he sort of scolded me, I guess as nicely as he could, and asked me to try to stop peeing in bed. And so after quite a few nights, and out of sheer embarrassment, I snuck out the way I had come in with wet sheets, went back to the apartment building where my mother was living. By that time, my brother had already escaped and run away to Switzerland, so she was the only one left. I got across the street from where she was, on the 3rd floor. I screamed and carried on. It was late at night. I had no idea how late, but finally she came to the window. I could see she was at the window. and I showed her the sheets that I had. I was hoping she would give me a set of sheets so that the priest wouldn't be angry with me. But she just waved me on, for me to go away. She wouldn't open the window. And it made me very, very angry my entire life. I was angry that she did that. And so I just went back to the church with the wet sheets. You know, that my mother, who was on many levels very valiant and all that, but what she showed me was fear. And I'm sorry that she was so afraid. And I wish you had, I would say to you, I wish you hadn't. It's too bad you were so scared. It's too bad you were so afraid. That you also made me so afraid for so much of the time. And yet, I understand it, but emotionally, it just had a great impact. On the other hand, perhaps that's what made me strong, that I was able to, go on. But mostly to my father, he died when I was 6 years old, and of course, the dead are always good people, so he must have been a good man if he died at the age of 42. And I would say to my father, it was not nice of you to die so young and leave me, as I thought, alone. And it wasn't very long after this incident that I just mentioned that, as a matter of fact, one of the family friends, who turned out was a family friend in the sense that he was my brother's friend, I didn't know him, he was also in the underground, and he heard that the Germans were about to invade the church that day. And so he told my cousin, who quickly came to get me, literally from, I guess, the American expression from the jaws of danger came to get me that night. It was the only time ever that I remember where something was imminently dangerous for me that I was aware of. Muttel was carrying me in his arms, so I was facing, as he was running away from the church, knowing that imminently somebody was coming. Incidentally, it did happen that the Gestapo was coming with sirens, etc., cars, and whatever else they had, towards the church. So I could see them. And the sirens and the noise and the lights suddenly at night, to me, was very eventful. I knew there was danger. I had no idea what it meant. He couldn't see because he was running forward. His back was to it. Mm-hmm. So he carried me and took me to another house where an elderly couple, where he hid me with an elderly couple. They were, I call them weavers. The couple, this elderly couple made straw furniture. And I don't know exactly, but I think the woman was mute, could not speak. And the man, her husband, was deaf. I think I spoke to them, and they either were able to lip read, but we communicated very well. She hugged me once in a while. The man was not particularly friendly, but he wasn't unfriendly. But they gave me something to do by teaching me how to make straw furniture. In many ways, what was a very scary time, they sort of calmed things down by virtue, if nothing else, by virtue of they're really not talking. They, it was sign language, and there was really hardly any noise in the apartment. I don't even remember music or whatever, so everything was very sort of calm, and I stayed with them for several months, hidden in their apartment, until I caused a situation where they felt they had to get rid of me, because during the day, when I had some time off, I would look out of the third-story window across the street where there was a Catholic school, and I'd see the kids come out and play. And I hadn't been with kids for a long time, and I really envied them. And the kids spotted me they saw me on the third floor, and I would sort of wave to them. They'd wave to me, and I guess I developed a nonverbal relationship with them. And then some adult saw me waving to them, and this adult who lived in the neighborhood knew that this couple didn't have any children. So for them, it became dangerous. So they called my cousin, Muttle, who came to get me so that he could put me in another couple's house to hide me. He took me, actually I wound up in 2-3 different places. One was a couple, I think, I don't know for sure, but one was a couple that I think he was a colleague, he was another doctor. They were not very friendly. It was very uncomfortable. I don't think I stayed there for more than, it seemed like a week or 2 weeks, very short time. I wasn't comfortable, nor were they, evidently, because they must have asked him. So he came and got me, and again he took me to another couple, another place in Brussels, not far away. And these were 2 women. I don't know what their relationship was. It might have been one was a daughter and a mother. They were very nice and so on. And then, after, I have no idea why I was taken from there, but then he took me to another place where it was a family. Of course, all these people were Goyim, non-Jews, but this one was a family with 2 children, I think. Yeah, I think 2 children, a boy and a girl. And the parents were very nice. And so when I got there in the evening, usually I was moved from one place to another at night. I got there at night. I didn't see the kids that evening. But the next day, the parents came in. They said, "We have a surprise for you." And these children came in to say hello. So I had, for the first time in a long time, I had kids. One was my age, one was older. But so I had kids to talk to. I stayed, I don't remember how many weeks I stayed with them until one morning I woke up and I couldn't open up my eyes. So I had had a good time there, but I couldn't open up my eyes, and the family got worried, so they called my cousin, who happened to be a doctor. He brought some medication. They couldn't figure out what was wrong, and that family got worried that if I needed medical attention, that would bring about my going to a hospital or whatever, and they might be denounced as people who were hiding a Jew. So they were so uncomfortable, they asked my cousin to take me away. And he took me, at that time, to his own apartment where he was with his girlfriend. And that turned out to be my favorite place, because his girlfriend was very, very nice. And I'll never forget it. She taught me how to tie my shoelaces. After that period that I just mentioned, being with my cousin and his girlfriend, after a while it was getting very, very dangerous to be in Brussels. So my mother and I were brought back together to hide in Eau de Gien, which is right near Waterloo, about, I would say, 25 miles outside of Brussels. And we were hidden in a farm. And at one point, during that period that we were hidden on the farm, my mother, I haven't a clue why, but she said to me, if anybody asks you if you're Jewish, deny it. Say, no, you're not. And I said by coincidence, because it seems as if it was the very next day, a young man, I would guess he was 17, 18, a farmer, who had up until that time taken a shine to me in that he was very nice to me, and he'd take me on a walk for where he was going to do the farming, and he would lift me up and put me on top of his Belgian horse. I don't know if you've ever seen a Belgian horse. It's a big horse, and I'd be sitting there with my legs flopping on the side. So I had a great time, and I really, if I could love someone then, I loved him. He was so nice to me and all that. And that very next day, there must have been something that was in the air about Jews being in the area or something. That very next day, suddenly he asked me if I was Jewish. And, you know, I was about 7 years old then. I denied it. And I've never forgiven myself. I've never forgiven myself. And to this day, there's a Yiddish expression, of tzalocha zeh, in spite of them, despite them. I should have said it, but you know, now I'm talking to you as an adult. Things were getting more and more desperate, more and more Germans were coming and looking for people. So living on the farm, there was one other Jewish family that was renting. We were renting an apartment on the farm. It wasn't as if these were nice goyim that were taking care of Jews. In this case, it was the underground. As it happens, it was a family friend, was paying for my mother and me to have an apartment. And it wasn't an apartment, it was a room. And there was one other family, a Jewish family, Silversteins, and they had a girl, a little girl. She was, I don't know why I call her little. I think she was probably my age. We were both little. And so I had a friend there, but I also developed a kinship with the rabbits on the farm. And it was, you know, being a city boy, I really hadn't lived with animals until then. And one of the things that comes to mind that happened at that time was I had made friends with one particular rabbit that I really liked a lot. But unfortunately, several weeks later, we had dinner, and we were the farmer, the woman farmer, her husband was mean, who really didn't, he overtly talked about how he didn't like Jews, but he didn't mind taking the money that we were giving him. We had dinner with them, unfortunately, every night. So here we were, 5, 7 people, and we were eating what I thought was a great chicken. And I think, like an ignorant little city boy, I said something about the great chicken, and they all laughed. I don't know if they all laughed, but nearly all of them laughed. Said, that's not chicken, that's rabbit. And it turned out to be the rabbit I loved. So you know, some of it was nice that I had a young friend, a girl that was around my age that we could talk. But outside of that, I did go. By the way, I did go to I'd been thrown out of school in Brussels, but I did go to a one-room schoolhouse. That was a fun school because the teacher was a great person. She was very nice. And the other students were, you know, it wasn't the whole school. So what here you would call from K through 8, it was all in one school. And we were all of about 10, 12 children. It was a very small town. So, you know, I didn't really get to know them too well, the other people. But it was a fun school to be in. and I was there for just a little while, and then the Germans came to the countryside, so I was moved again to a convent. I was hidden in the convent for 2 years. So a description of the convent, well, what am I talking about? 16th century walls, very old buildings. I was told, you asked me about being asked if I was ever asked if I was a Jew. Well, Mother Superior, when I was brought to her immediately, and she told me right then and there, don't ever tell anyone that you're Jewish while you're in this place. The Mother Superior was a very serious woman, very stern, probably the image that I might, if somebody had asked me about it, I might have had that even beforehand. But I remember her as being very stern and not very comfortable to be with. One of the good things for me, either I was extremely smart or just lucky or instinctively trying to save my life, in that I had to, in the convent, they converted me. I had to do all the things that a little Catholic boy would have to do in a convent. I helped a priest every morning, and one of the things many of the other boys that were in the convent were not Jews. They'd perhaps come out of the orphanage. They were rather unfriendly to the Jewish boys. They discovered very quickly that I was Jewish. And one day I asked probably the oldest boy in our group, who didn't like to do the bidding for the priest every morning, I told him that I would do it for him if he wanted me to, because I was an early riser even then. And so I did all the work that an altar boy did. I did the altar boy work for him, and he made sure that all the anti-Semitic remarks, everybody that would rough me up, because I was a slight boy and fearful. Every time they would try to rough me up, he started protecting me. That's what I meant when I said earlier, I must have been, there was somewhere, I must have been wise. I didn't know he was going to do that. But while I did his bidding as an altar boy, he defended me. You know, one of the things that it always perplexed me, and I was always surprised at how is it that I knew, it felt like I was playing a role. It felt like I was in a show. And I don't think I'm saying that as an adult. You know, I really remember as a kid just feeling like this is really not what's meant to be for me. And in a way, you know, when the Mother Superior said to me, remember, first of all, don't let anybody know that you're Jewish, and they changed my name. Albert Nova. Don't ask me why a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid was named Nova, but they gave me an Italian name. By then we're talking about 1943, 1944. By then the Germans weren't bombing Namur, because Namur was really occupied by the Germans. By then it was the British and the Americans that were bombing Namur. They were trying to bomb the Germans. I don't remember the British or an American bomb that came down and got stuck between two steeples and didn't explode. And it stayed there. And I think it took quite a while. We were warned not to go near that particular part of the church. And eventually I guess they took it down and disarmed it. So yeah, but I spent a lot of time in a hidden underground. At the end of my stay in the convent, when they said somebody was coming to get me to bring me back to my mother, I was wondering. I couldn't remember what she looked like. I had just about totally lost track of what my brother looked like. I wasn't even sure. I think I knew that I had a brother, but I did remember Muttle. The very same woman who had been hired or asked by the underground to take me to Namur and to the convent, or to the orphanage at the time, the very same woman 2 years later came to get me to take me back to Brussels. And she brought me back to Mr. Vinnick. Mr. Vinnick was the underground friend of my father's that had helped hide my mother and helped hide me as well. And this woman came to get me. We rode the train back to Brussels, and then I was brought back to Mr. Vinnick, who, oddly enough, in spite of the fact that I couldn't remember my mother, but I could remember him. He had been involved in so many things with me. I discovered afterwards that when they took me away from that farm, brought me to another farm where I stayed by myself in an attic that was one of the dangerous parts of my history, in that Germans came one floor below where I was hiding, and fortunately didn't realize that there was a ceiling door where I was hiding. I spent some time there, some weeks there. And at that time, when I was taken to this other farm to be hidden separately from my mother, the underground, had I'm going to call it a log cabin, but it sounds like a fancy place. It wasn't. It was a hut in the woods where she spent the next year and a half, and the underground brought her food there, not far from where we had stayed on the farm. So that's where she was. I didn't know this. I didn't know this until afterwards. Interestingly enough, Mr. Vinnick, my mother was at his apartment in Brussels. He came to get me at the train station and brought me to his apartment and walked in, and he had never told my mother that he was about to bring me back. And I walked in, I looked around, I didn't recognize her until she yelled out, "Albert!" Then I realized that this woman, I knew that she, I don't know if I put the name in French, mère, I don't know if that's what I thought, but I think I realized it then that she was my mother. Well, Max came back a few weeks after that from Switzerland. He had left at the age of 16. He came back. He was around 19. He was a much bigger, broader guy. He had worked as a lumberjack in Switzerland, so he was much stronger. It was really being with my mother for a few weeks until he came back. I guess looking at pictures and things that she discussed with me, then I began to remember him. It was wonderful because my mother was really not doing that well in many ways. She had a lot of problems. And so it was a relief to see someone in the family that was doing well. Muttle was in the underground, and he was caught during the war. He was taken to a concentration camp. He went along doing what the Germans wanted him to do, and that is to work on healing them, taking care of them as a doctor, but on only one condition: if they allowed him to also work with the inmates, the prisoners, the Jewish people that were taken. He said he would do that. As soon as they told him he couldn't work with the prisoners anymore, he stopped working with the Germans, and he couldn't stand working with the Germans, so he committed suicide. So I never saw Martin again. I know all this because there were 10 other doctors from Brussels who were colleagues of his who had been taken and, spent time in that same camp with them, and they all survived. They all came back to Brussels, and they told us the story. The war wasn't quite over. My mother and I went back to Audegien, this place in the countryside where we had been hidden. We went back to that farm where we stayed hidden, and really because I guess we couldn't get an apartment in Brussels yet. As a matter of fact, there I experienced something that to this day I found extremely traumatic. There was a bombing raid by the Americans and the British, and they shot with the planes. They shot at the entire countryside, and probably like 50 horses were shot as part of what was going on. And here they were on this hill in a plain in Audegien. And when it was over, there were dead horses all over this plain. And my mother and I went where everybody else went to see what was going on. And everybody, including my mother, ran with knives in their hands to cut up the horses to get some meat, something they hadn't had much of the entire war. And as a 9.5-year-old kid, I was horrified by the scene. I understand it, but it was like that people would just do that. And it's not like I'm a vegetarian. It still boggles the mind. Anyway, so what I'm trying to tell you is that there were events. The end of the war is a newspaper story. It's a radio story. It's a TV story, and today it's an internet story. The end of the war is a one momentary thing. But for me as a child, it took quite a while before I even realized it. When I was with my mother, it was different, but the war wasn't quite over. When those horses were shot at, the war was really not quite over. And I guess perhaps one of the moments that I can think of that would be instrumental in my realizing that the war was over is when I went back to the elementary school I'd been taken out of 4.5 years earlier. And I went back there, and I walked into the 5th grade, and the teacher was the same mean anti-Semitic teacher who had smiled and smirked when the Gestapo came in to take me out. He was my teacher again. And I think that's when I realized that maybe the war was over, but it wasn't over for me. We finally found an apartment. For a little while, my brother, my mother, and I lived together. Then my brother married very soon after that. My mother and I lived together, and then at one point, she received a letter that said she had the right to go downtown Brussels, where there was a warehouse of furniture that had been confiscated by the Nazis. And she could go look through the furniture to see if she could find any of her old furniture so that we would have a little bit more than what we had. She went, and she couldn't find any furniture. She walked out of that warehouse. This was downtown Brussels, and she threw herself under a streetcar. Fortunately, the streetcar stopped just enough not to hurt her too much. But in Belgium at that time, if a person attempted suicide, they took him to what I guess today would call, or at that time would call, an insane asylum. So she wound up in an asylum for a year. My brother was married and just recently married. He wasn't able or ready to take care of me. So they sent me to Antwerp, another big city in Belgium, to another orphanage, but this was a fromme orphanage. It was ultra-Orthodox orphanage of children from the Holocaust who would wind up in Israel in a kibbutz. And I spent a year there. That is, in retrospect, when you think about it, right? Going from a Catholic convent to an ultra-Orthodox orphanage, where I learned how to pray night and day in Ivrit, learned how to speak Hebrew so well that I even forgot some of my French, because we only spoke Ivrit there. But I was only there for a year. As soon as my mother was released from her asylum, I went back to live with her. I continued to be pushed around by high school goyim who hit me. They still, I was a very slight boy. They hit me until I went to take some boxing lessons and then boxed one of them out in public, so then they stopped hitting me. It was I was in therapy for 10 years as an adult. I can't say to you 100% that it all had to do with having had, a traumatic 5 years. It's very difficult to say how it shaped me, except in 1990, many hidden children. This is now a Hidden Child Foundation, ADL, they're connected to them. The American Defamation League. Anyway, so several of them in New York had been meeting with each other and talking to each other, and they said, there are probably an awful lot of hidden children around this world from the Holocaust. And we're sort of a group that is, I don't know if it's forgotten or not thought of outside of Anne Frank and all that, but, we're really not thought of in any way. And they thought, well, maybe let's make an announcement. They announced, let's get together at the Marriott Hotel, and it was advertised around the world, and 1,600 people from around the world came to a meeting of the hidden children. And I think, in spite of having been in therapy and all that, and in spite of, which made me think about my past and how I behaved and so on, but in a way, that hidden child experience with other people where we had a chance to sort of share with each other how we were as people, I think I realized then that for many years, from 1945 to 1990, this is what, 35 years, right? Or 45? No, what was I? Yeah, 45.
Yeah,
45 years, I really had a sort of a hidden personality. I often found it difficult to speak in a straight fashion. I'm a great joker. I know I haven't told you any jokes because you didn't ask me to, but I love to joke. And joking is a very good way to, keep yourself from really dealing with what hurts. So I discovered for many years that I was a hidden personality. And I think that I agree with some of what I heard, that I can attribute to a result of the experience I had as a child, as a hidden child. My mother's sisters and a brother wanted us to move with them. They felt bad for us. They wanted us to have an easier life, so they invited us to move to the United States. By the way, I didn't want to move to the United States. I ran away from home twice so I could go to Israel, but they made me go back to Brussels. The mean people. They keep telling you that we should know history so that it won't repeat itself. Guess what? It repeats itself continuously in different forms. The message is learn and see if you can find some way to ameliorate how we treat each other, how we deal with each other. I hope, for example, that not necessarily my story, but all the stories get discussed, get known about, but it's good, I think, for children to know that it's not just bang, bang, bang and who won. It's a daily life. It affects all of us when there's war or when there's denial or hatred that it goes on. So I say the more you publicize it, the better it is.